What are warm and cool colours in art? That's what we're going to look at in this video. Welcome back to my channel. If we haven't met before, my name is Michelle. On this channel you'll find lots of watercolour techniques, colour mixing, a little bit of mixed media too. Please do consider subscribing. It's free. I make one video a week here on YouTube on a Thursday with extra content on Saturdays for my Patreon subscribers. Now I'm going to make a bold assertion today. I'm going to say to you that after watching the whole of this video, you will finally understand not only what warm and cool colours mean regarding to art and to painting, but you will also have actual examples in your head of what colours are warm and cool within your palette. You'll be able to recognise which colours are warm and cool and to understand how that will benefit your painting. And the reason I'm saying this is because I'm going to explain it to you in a way that I have been explaining to students for years, but that you may not have seen before. And I want you to understand that I'm not going to use something that is radically different. The science of this is exactly what the science has always been. It is not possible to alter that. But I'm not going to use a colour wheel because I don't know about you, but I just find colour wheels a bit overwhelming. You know, you look at the colour wheel and all of a sudden it's, oh my god, there's all of the colours, and you know, your brain has a little bit of trouble computing it. At least if it's anything like mine, which is not very mathematical, then your brain may have a little bit of a struggle with a colour wheel. So we're going to do something that I tend to call more of a family tree method. In other words, we're going to start with the primaries and we're going to work down into what those colours mix into, and we're going to look at every single colour and look at what's warm and what's cool within that colour grouping. So that's all the primaries, the secondaries, and the earth colours. There aren't actually that many. Before you think, well, that sounds like hundreds, it's not that many colours, but I'm going to go through each one and explain it and paint the colours out for you so that you can see. But before that, we're going to have a really brief chat about exactly what is meant by warm and cool colours. So the first thing to think about with colour is it's not as fixed as you would imagine. So we tend to look at an object, say a green apple, and we just think of that, you know, that object, that thing, as being green. It is a green thing, but the truth is that colour only exists in the brain. It's just the way that our eyes interpret the light bouncing off of something, and this is just in humans. Now if you think about humans as being part of the whole animal kingdom, all animals experience the senses differently to us. So all the things that you think of as being really fixed, you know, the things you taste, the things you see, the things you hear, the things you touch, other animals have different experiences to you. So you can look at a car and you know that that's a red car. You can see it's a red car, but if you show it to your dog, I can assure you your dog does not see a red car. Dogs can't see red at all. Now let's look at taste. If you taste something that's sweet, it's sweet to you as a human, but I can assure you that if your cat were to taste it, don't give your cat sweet things, if your cat were to taste it, your cat would not taste any sweetness because cats can't discern the taste of sweet things. They're obligate carnivores. They do not need to taste ice cream and sweeties. So the way that you view colour and the way that you view your senses is not as fixed as you might think. So why do we even describe colours as being warm colours or being cool colours? The truth is it's just a construct of language. If I were holding two apples in front of you and one was red and one was green, one wouldn't feel warmer or cooler than the other. The coolness or the warmth is nothing to do with the colour, but it's a way that we as humans have evolved and have found a way of describing colours and of grouping them, and it's really helpful to us in understanding colour, particularly from the point of view of being an artist. So as humans, we discovered the world and we looked around us and we saw the sun in the sky, we saw deserts, we saw heat, we saw fire. These things are red, they are orange, and they are yellow. So in our brains, these colours became associated with warmth and with heat. Now on the flip side, look at all the things that are cold. What about ice? What about mountains in the distance? What about grass that's cool under our feet? What about water? Now these things are all associated with blues, with greens, with purple. So in our brains, these colours became associated with coolness. So I'm going to point the camera downwards now and we're going to swatch some colours. We're going to start by looking at the primary colours, and I'm going to explain to you why even the primary colours are not as fixed as you might think. So here I've swatched the three primary colours. So we've got yellow, blue and red. So we've got one cool and two warm. Now if you learnt at school that these were the primary colours, I'm here to tell you that they didn't tell you the whole truth. If you asked a scientist what the primary colours were, they would tell you red, blue, green. Now there's a reason for this, and I won't go into a lot of colour theory at the moment because you don't need to know it. But let me just explain briefly that there are two types of ways of mixing colours. There's additive and there's subtractive. So when you have things like light and refractions of light bouncing off of surfaces, you can subtract colours from other colours. You can take a colour and take its component parts out. However, when it comes to colour mixing, we can only add colours together. Now, we can't make yellow if our third primary is green, and that's why artists consider that the third primary is yellow, because we can mix these two together and get green. However, if you've ever tried to take your palette down to just 3 colours, if you've ever thought to yourself, okay, well logically I can mix everything from these 3 colours, you'll pretty soon discover it doesn't work very well. Even to get a very broad range of colours, you're going to need several different versions of the primary colours. Now, if I design a starter paint set, as I have done in the past, I'm about to do another one, I would include a warm and cool version of each of these primaries because it gives you a greater range of mixing. But that said, even with those, you can't mix everything. There are certain bright greens that are actually, if you look on the tubes, you'll see that they're just a single pigment. And that doesn't seem to make any sense, because if these are our primaries, then a tube of green paint must contain a yellow pigment and a blue pigment. So the fact that it doesn't proves to you that these aren't necessarily the primaries. You can't mix every single colour from these. You can mix a version of every single hue from these. You can mix all the secondaries and the neutrals, and that is why these are considered useful. But to be honest, there is no absolute 3 colours that you can mix every hue in the world from, so that's just something to be aware of. But for the purposes of colour mixing, it's going to help you to understand that these are the 3 colours where everything begins. But just understand that if you meet a scientist and they tell you that yellow is not a primary, that green is the third primary, they're not necessarily wrong. Well, that's so far so simple. Of course, anyone could understand that blue is cool and that yellow and red are warm. However, have you ever heard people talk about cool yellows, warm blues? What does this mean? We're getting into the territory now of relative warmth and relative coolness within a grouping. So if you look, for example, at yellows, all yellows are warm. However, some might be warmer or cooler than others. So the easiest way for me to explain this is to look at something like soup. Let's think about soup. So you have 2 bowls of soup in front of you and they're both hot. You have 2 bowls of hot soup in front of you. One is absolutely scalding. It's just been boiling. You couldn't possibly drink it yet. The other bowl of soup is hot, but it's cooled down a bit, so you can start to eat that one for your supper. So of course you can think that both of these bowls of soup are hot, but one's a little bit cooler than the other. This is where relative warmth and coolness within a colour grouping comes in. So first of all, we're going to look at yellow. So within the colour grouping of yellows, which colours would be considered relatively warm and which colours would be considered relatively cool? Now, there aren't many yellows that are considered to be cool yellows, and pretty much there's only one that's generally described as being a cool yellow, and that's lemon yellow. But that would encompass things like nickel titanate and Aurelian, all of those lighter yellows. Now, here's our yellow, and it can tend slightly towards the blue. It could have a little touch of blue in, pushing it not fully green, but just slightly a bit more acid. If you must have seen a yellow, lemon yellow, and it's got a little bit of acidity towards it, that's because it's got a little bit of blue in. Now, likewise, if I put a little tiny touch of red in, not enough to make it orange, but just to warm it up a bit, then I'll get a warm yellow. So let's have a look. This is, I've got some Daniel Smith lemon yellow here. So let's swatch some of that. And you can see it's quite an acid colour. It really is the colour of lemons. And it wouldn't take more than a tiny, tiny drop of blue to push it into green. So that's our cool yellow. Now, I'm not mixing these colours from scratch. I'm using colours that I've already got in my palette, but do feel free to have a go. You know, if you've got a yellow, try putting the tiniest touch of blue in it and see what happens, and try putting the tiniest touch of red in it and see what happens there. So let's go up to a warm yellow. So this is some Talens Rembrandt, and this is Cadmium Yellow Deep. So you get your cool yellows, and then after that they're pretty much all considered to be warmer shades of yellow. So this would include earth colours like yellow ochre, which is somewhere between an earth and a yellow, Naples yellow, even moving up to things like quinacridone gold, which are almost coming out of the yellows and into browns. So this would be considered cool yellow. and all of these more orangey yellows would be considered a warm yellow. One that would be probably right in the middle of those two groups would be something like a cadmium yellow light. Not quite as acid as lemon, but without any noticeable orange tint to it. So let's look now at the other warm primary. Let's look at red. And while we're looking at red, I'm also going to talk to you about pink. Now, technically, pink is not a different colour to red. It's just a cool version of red that is less saturated. So in terms of paint, it might be watered down or it might be mixed with white. It's less saturated version of red. However, because people tend to think of pink as being its own colour, we're going to go through that one too. So here's our red, another warm colour. And again, it can be cooled down with blue, or it can be warmed up with yellow. So if we cool it down with blue, we're looking at more of a crimson colour. And these are the colours that typically, when either watered down in the case of watercolours or added to white in the case of things like acrylics, these are the sort of reds that would then bleed into being pinks. When they're desaturated, they become pinks. Now at the other end, if we add a bit of yellow to our red, we're going to push it a bit more into orange. So here we start off with things like scarlet. So I've got some Talon's Rembrandt Cadmium Red Light here. This would be considered a warm red. Can you see how with just a little bit more yellow it could become an orange? Now there are other types of warm reds. There are also more of the earth reds. So these would be brick red colours, and these would include things like Venetian red, what is called light red in some brands, those terracotta reds. They would also be considered warm reds. So what about pink? Pink, again, although it is just a version of red, it tends to be thought of as a separate colour. So I've actually got a whole video about pink and how useful it is as a mixing colour. Now I've got a really bright one here. This is Daniel Smith Opera Pink. This would be considered a cool pink. With a touch more blue, it's into things like magenta. This is what happens when you add a bit of blue to your pink. You get this kind of bright, fresh pink. Now here I've got some SAA Permanent Rose, and it's not a typical permanent rose colour. It's actually very peach. So I'm going to swatch this one for you. And here's what happens when you add a little bit more yellow into your pink mix. You start getting peaches and corals, and these would be considered to be warm pinks. So the last one of the primary colours, the cool colour, is blue, and we're going to look at that next. Now you may have been rather confused about blues. You may have heard people describe certain blues as cool blues or warm blues, and then other people might describe completely different blues as warm blues or cool blues. Now there's a scientific reason for that, and I'm going to explain it to you. I'm going to explain why there's no consensus over what is a warm or a cool blue. I'm also going to give you a better way of understanding blues. It's actually a method that manufacturers use to describe blues. If you've ever heard of something like phthalo blue green shade or phthalo blue red shade, I'm going to explain to you what that means and how we can categorise and understand blues. So now we've got blue, and it's a very unusual case. Now up until this point, what we've done is we've taken these warm colours and we've either warmed them up by adding the other warm primary, or we've cooled them down by adding the other cool primary. But do you see the problem? Here's our blue, and it's sitting either side of two warm primaries. So we can warm it up with red, or we can warm it up with yellow. Now these give us different types of blue, but neither can accurately be described as warm or cool. Do you see a blue with red in as warmer than a blue with yellow in, or do you see it the other way around? Neither is actually wrong. So I'm going to show you the type of colours that we get when we push towards the yellow, and the type of colours we get when we push towards the red end of the spectrum. But whether you describe either of these areas as warm or cool is really up to you. Now, there is a way that the manufacturers describe these type of blues, and it's an easier way than describing them as warm and cool. They describe them as red-based blues. So these are the ones that tend towards red, and they describe them, wait for it, as green-based blues. This is the problem we have between this third primary of whether it's yellow and whether it's green. Now, of course, if you add yellow, you get green. So it kind of makes sense that they would describe the colours at this end as red-based blues and the colours at this end as green-based blues. So let me show you what they look like. So this is a phthalo blue, and this would be typically considered to be a green-based blue. Now phthalos come, it's just a pigment and they come in different types, so you do also get different types. You do get those phthalo blue red shades, that's where the name comes from, but this one is fairly yellow based. Now within the green based blues you're going to have all of the turquoise blues, things like teal, things like Prussian blue. Those are going to be your green based blues. So what about the red based blues? Well, there's one very famous one, and that is ultramarine. So ultramarine has a real red bias to it. Another one that's close to that is cobalt. That's also a little bit further towards the red end of the spectrum rather than the green or yellow end of the spectrum. If you'd like a discount off of Jackman's Art Materials, I have a code for you in the description. You can get 10% off of all of their art materials. Now, French ultramarine typically is even more towards the red end of the spectrum than standard ultramarine. This is why I picked this one up. So I'm going to swatch this one for you so that you can see the difference. Now, it wouldn't take very much red or pink added to this mix at all to push it into purple. Already got a slight purple hint to it. So typically blues like this are your red based blues, blues like this are your green based blues, or your yellow based blues if you prefer to describe them that way. Whether you consider one of those to be a warm or to be a cool blue is really down to your individual perception of colour. So we've looked at the three primary colours and how warm and cool applies to them. We're going to look now at secondary colours. There are three secondary colours and each one is made by mixing one combination of primary colours together. So the first one we're going to look at is green. So whilst, as discussed earlier, greens can indeed be a single pigment colour, we typically think of mixing green from blue and yellow, and that's a way that you can make green. So what would a warm green look like? Typically it would be one that tended towards having more yellow in it and less blue, and a cool green would be one that's got more blue and less yellow. So let's look at what they might look like practically. So I've got a little bit of Jackman's Art Materials Spring Green on my palette just because it was there the other day when I was using it. I'm going to put a little bit more of the phthalo in so we can see what a cool green looks like. So at the cool end of the green spectrum, the blue based greens, you're looking at greens that tend towards aqua, pine, greens where you can see a lot of blue in the mix. Now for the warm greens, I've got here some Daniel Smith green gold, so let's look at that one. Now with your warm greens, you're typically looking at things like lime green, olive green, all of those warm yellow based greens. So it's quite easy to see the difference there between this green that has more blue in the mix and this green that has more yellow in the mix. So this is your cool green and this is your warm green. At this point, if you're getting some value from this video, if you're finding it helpful, I'd really love it if you could help me to grow my YouTube channel. It's very simple. It'll take you just a couple of seconds and won't cost you a penny. Could you please click the like button? Now, YouTube rewards audience interaction, which means that if you click like or share or subscribe or even leave me a comment, that will help my channel to grow and I'll be so grateful. Our next secondary colour is purple, so we're going to look at that one next. So we have the same kind of thing happening with our purples in that they're a mix between a warm and a cool primary, a blue and a red. So it's really quite simple. The purples that have more blue in are the cool purples and the purples that have more red in are the warm purples. So what does that actually look like? Now for cool purples it could look like this cobalt violet here, this lilac colour, but it could equally look like this deep permanent violet. So this is a purple that has got quite a lot of blue in it. So for the blue based purples, cool purples, we are looking at things like lilac and we're looking at things like royal purple. Now when it comes to warm violets and warm purples, we look at purples with typically a bit more red in. So what do they look like? We're talking about aubergine, we're talking about plum, we're talking about maroon. Can you see how this mix has so much more red in it? Again, you don't have to use ready-made colours like this. You could take a colour like this one and put more red in it and see what happened. So these are your cool purples, the royal purples and the lilacs, and these are your warm purples, and these would be the plums, the aubergines, the maroons. And the last of the secondary colours before we look at neutrals is orange. So just like blue, orange can also be a little bit tricky because what is orange? Orange is a mix between yellow and red. Now they are both warm, so if your orange has more yellow in or has more red in, again, which one do you consider warm and which one do you consider cool? There is no correct answer. I can tell you how I tend to see them, and there's not really any logic to it. It's just, as I said, it's just my perception. So let's swatch a bit of this one here. This is your standard bright orange. This is a Talens Rembrandt permanent orange. It's literally the colour of the orange fruit. So there we are, or a Tangerina Satsuma, something like that. There we are, there's your bright orange. So this is an orange that has a lot of yellow in. And in my mind, to me, that seems like the cooler version. So what is a warm orange? A warm orange is one that has more red in. So what does an orange with more red look like? So this is Winsor & Newton orange red shade. And this has a lot more red in. So we're looking now at more of those sunset colours. Those colours that you see in a hot country when the sun goes down. Now to me, they just seem a little bit more vibrant and a little bit warmer. So in my mind, this is a cool orange and this is a warm orange. But as I said, they both tend towards a warm colour. This one tends towards yellow, this one tends towards red. So there is no right or wrong. It's just a matter of which one of these you consider to be cool and which one you consider to be warm. But that's the way that I've always seen them. Now secondary colours, as we've seen, are made when you mix two primary colours together. What about if you mix all three of the primary colours together? What happens then? Well, the simple answer is that you get a neutral shade, a mixed shade, a muddy colour. Now you will either get a version of brown or a version of grey. So what determines if you get grey or if you get brown? It's quite simple, it's due to the amount of blue in the mix. So blue is our cool primary. If the mix that you're making is majority blue, then when you mix all three primary colours together, you will end up with a grey. However, if the mix that you have made has got a lot more red and yellow in, then you will end up with a brown. But let's look now at what happens within those colour groupings and what would be considered a warm and cool brown, or what would be considered a warm and cool grey. So we're going to look at browns first. So although brown is a warm neutral and all browns are warm neutrals, some have more of a blue bias than others. So one that would be considered cool is this one here. This is raw umber and it's got quite a lot of yellow in and also quite a lot of blue. There's not very much onto the red side of the spectrum, so let me swatch that one. And there we are. Now another one that would be considered to be a cooler brown would be something like sepia. So what does a warm brown look like? Well, you've got things like burnt sienna that almost goes into red, but you've also got burnt umber, and this is the one that I typically think of as a warm brown. So let's swatch that one so you can see the difference. So straight away, it just looks more red and more orange, doesn't it? So here's an example of a warm and cool brown. So with the cool browns, you've got these umbers, these raw umbers, and you've got these sepia colours and these sort of neutral colours. This would include lots of things like beige and cream as well. And on the other side, you've got the warm browns like this burnt umber, and you can see how much more red there is in the mix. Now grey is overwhelmingly thought of as a cool colour, but you may have heard people talk of warm greys. Exactly what do they mean? I'm going to show you now. So let's look at a grey which is typically thought of as a cool grey. So this is Payne's grey, and it's typically a very blue grey. Payne's grey has so much blue pigment in that I actually keep it on my palette alongside the blues, because if you add yellow to it, you'll get green. If you add red to it, you'll get purple. There'll be a dull version, of course, but here is our cool grey. This is a grey that has even more blue pigment in than other greys. Now I could just warm this grey up by adding a little bit more yellow and a little bit more red, and I'm talking about tiny amounts. It would still be a grey, but it just wouldn't be quite as cold looking. But I've got this one here. This is Davies grey. It's quite a weak colour and it's a kind of slightly yellowish greenish grey. So can you see the difference there? It's just a little bit less blue and a little bit more towards the red yellow end of the spectrum, but still remaining grey. So of all the colours we've looked at today, one of the ones that causes people the most problem is greens, and that's because there's just so many of them out there. Whenever we're painting landscapes or flowers or botanicals, we need to mix accurate greens. I've got a great video that's got 10 recipes for brand new greens that you can mix. It's really easy to understand. I think you'll enjoy watching it. You can look at that one right now.